we can begin with a Surah Al-Fatiha for all of our marhumin. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين أما بعد فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم صلوات على محمد وآل محمد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Our discussion inshallah tonight and tomorrow night is entitled Maintaining Tawheed in a Progressive Society. We want to understand how Islam responds to the challenges of a progressive society. And as that progression takes place in various different institutions of life, how does Islam respond and seek for you and I to be a means, the religion, be a means of maintaining our spirituality, our human development and growth, in the concept of remaining in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, in order for us to have this discussion, it requires us to be able to define, delineate some of these terms so that we're all on the same page. So that if I say, for example, progressive society or Tawheed, we mean the same thing. We understand the same definition. Otherwise, it may be that we're looking at the same word from two or maybe multiple angles. It also requires us to examine the question around how we see our own individual development and our collective development, and whether Islam is the end or whether Islam is the means, or rather whether you and I are the means or whether you and I are the ends in itself. If we wish to be able to maintain our spirituality, how is it that we can do this in a society that in its foundation seeks to remove spirituality? Or if the society is a spiritual society, is its definition of spirituality in keeping with ours, or are they in contention with our definitions of spirituality? And so it requires us as a foundation to be able to query what are the specific challenges in a progressive society, and how is that responded to by a particular source of response in Islamic literature that might be relative to the time and space that we live in, but also something that is rooted within the examples of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Maintaining Tawheed, Islam in a progressive society. What do we mean by progressive society? A progressive society in this discussion means a secular liberal society. Arguably, we do not actually live in a progressive society. A progressive society is one that would push forward the maintenance and progression of the individual and put the individual and collective development at its pedestal and seek for that to be a way in which we could actually measure whether the society is moving forward. We normally talk about things like social development and social stability. We can measure whether those things are in place or not. That would be a progressive society. Rather, in this question, how do we maintain our tawheed in a progressive society, means how do we maintain our tawheed in a society that is secular liberal, that actually from its foundations, arguably, seeks to strip away the principles of tawheed, or feels a challenge from the sentiments of tawheed. Based upon those challenges, how then do we define them, and how then do we respond to them as Muslims in the times in which we are living in? Then when we come to the question of defining tawheed, is tawheed simply the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or is it something greater than that? When you and I think about the tawheed at the time of revelation, what was it about their tawheed that made them a progressive society? What was it about the type of tawheed that was being practiced by the Holy Prophet of Islam that may be different to the type of tawheed that we are understanding in its practice today? And therefore, for us to truly understand tawheed, we have to understand the way in which the prophetic movement defined its tawheed for the individual and for the collective, in order to respond to the challenges that were prevalent within the time. So what are we going to do tonight, inshallah? How do we introduce this topic? The first thing for us to do is to reflect upon the typical challenges that we have in a progressive society, meaning a secular liberal society, and then for us to be able to juxtapose those with the types of challenges that were prevalent at the time of revelation, to see whether there is a relationship between them, to see where it might be different, and through that we'll be able to see how Islam at that time was a progressive force, did bring about tawheed in ultimately was a godless pagan society, and to see whether there is any relationship between that achievement then and an achievement for us to be able to do so today. So for tonight, inshallah, we want to ask ourselves, what are the challenges of a secular liberal society, and to go back in time and to think about the challenges at the time of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Secularism, liberalism are two different things. And so for us to say that there is a secular liberal society, and then to call it a progressive society, these are all very different terms, very different definitions. So we need for you and I to understand exactly what we mean by them. We may differ on the definition, and we can do that in the discussion or in the Q&A after. But for now, in order to present it, we need to have some sort of wide definition that we can all agree upon. If you imagine the sorts of challenges that we have today, are we really a progressive society? How do you define progression? If I was sitting with you now and I said Iraq, Somalia, Pakistan, and I said the words second world or third world, what would that mean to you? Arguably, it would mean that it is in its economic development. It is a second world or third world developed country, correct? And the reason as to why we have come collectively to agree that it's third world, by virtue of its infrastructure, by virtue of its governance, by virtue of its economic platform in the world, we have stated that we define whether a country is first, second or third world based upon its economic development, for example, as opposed to its moral development. Or, for example, as opposed to how measurable it is with the number of people being monotheistic. And I'm not saying that's the right way or the wrong way. But in order for us to think about how we view progression and regression, and then how we come to understand the concepts of liberalism and secularism and their impact upon Islam, we immediately have to accept that there are terms that have come to envelope us, and they themselves have taken over the way in which we see the world itself. For me to say that Pakistan or Iraq or Somalia is third world, whilst Canada, America and Britain, for example, would be first world, immediately creates a world view that states that progression is primarily based on economic progression, as opposed to any other type of progression. So now have a look again at the way our question is structured. Our question was, maintaining Tawheed, Islam in a progressive society. Therefore, by this assumption, the more economically challenged the society is, the less progressive it is. And the more economically flourishing a society is, the more progressive it is. Whereas immediately, you and I might say something different. A society that is looking after its weakest is the most progressive. A society that champions the needs of its most vulnerable, that is the most progressive. A society that liberates its own community from the shackles that have stopped it from reaching the fullness of its potential, that is a progressive society. So immediately the question is reopposed to you. What is a progressive society? Is a progressive society one that is measured by its economic output, by its GDP? Or is a progressive society the one that yields the opportunity for a human being to fulfill his God-given potential? I would argue it's the latter. And I imagine you also would argue it is the latter. That immediately makes us question, well, what is a progressive society? And it also makes you ask, are you living in a progressive society? If, for example, you were a black person or a person of colour, male, 15 to 25, would you feel that this is a progressive society? If you're defining it economically, then your argument might be one. If you're going to define it based on opportunity for success, your answer may be something different. The experience of one person may immediately state this is not a progressive society. If, for example, you are a woman today living in India or in Pakistan, would you claim that this is a progressive society? Outwardly, you would say, in Pakistan, there is God. It's a Muslim community. The constitution is based upon a Muslim society. In India, there is a great degree of plurality. By and large, especially in the urban areas in India, there is a great amount of respect for each and every different culture, different type of sect, different type of manifestation of religious practice. Is that, though, the definition of a progressive society? If, for example, you are a woman living in that society, the fact that you may not feel secure and safe to walk out in the streets after 8 p.m, you may say, no, this is not a progressive society, because the very foundation of my ability to achieve has not been given to me. So I'm asking you this question. When you and I say we are living in a progressive society, well, what do you mean by that? And often the way in which we define these terms are very coloured because of an external force of education, an external force of media that has come to define these terms for us. We come to accept them, imbibe them, and regurgitate them, thinking that this is the correct definition of something. When again, just by this very question, you will see that we may not necessarily appreciate what is a truly progressive society. Now, having seen that, and we're asking ourselves, Islam and our living of Islam in a progressive society, it then immediately makes us ask, well, what is Islam? Is Islam Salah, Sawm, Zakat, Khums, Hajj, Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar? Is your Islam the correct performance of wudu and making sure that I wash my arms this many number of times, and if I do it more times, my wudu is invalid, and therefore my Islam is also not fulfilled? Is this Islam? Is Islam coming to the Husayniyah and lamenting and mourning over the martyrdom anniversaries of the great saintly figures of Islam, and then coming and reciting elegy on them, and then performing various different forms of ma'tam? Is that Islam? I'm not saying it's not, I'm not saying it is. I'm asking you, what do you think is Islam? Is Islam the tool and the vehicle for a person to be able to achieve everything that he or she had hoped to be able to achieve in the fullness of their life? Is Islam the breaking of the shackles and the burdens that society places upon you, so that whatever challenges and forms of inhibition upon your own potential are broken? Is that what Islam is? It then fosters the question, well, what type of Islam are you living today? Are you living the Islam which is more focused on the fiqhi questions? Is your Islam more focused on the lamentation? Or is your Islam a source for breaking whatever shackles are placed upon you individually and collectively? Which one? Based upon these elementary questions that I wish to pose, it makes us think about how we approach this subject, because we have to be able to think about, if we're going to talk about Tawheed and maintaining Tawheed and maintaining godliness, maintaining our spirituality, well, what type of society are we living in, and what type of Tawheed are we thinking about? Because without having thought about these primary questions, we will not be able to sufficiently answer them tonight and most probably tomorrow in the second part of our discussion, inshallah. Now, the challenges that our society provides us are numerous. The secularism that was initiated in the Enlightenment period arguably has evolved and is very different to the type of secularism that we are faced with today. Liberalism that was initiated in the Enlightenment was also something that has evolved over the last few centuries and has its own understanding today. And in light of that, it requires us to think about what are the prevailing challenges that the society has to the Muslim and the way in which that impacts the Muslim today. Forgive me for my language, I need to mention this, but you understand why I'm mentioning it, and I don't want there to be any shock value. You know? We're all adults here. Last week in Iceland, and also in the last couple of years previously in Germany as well, there has been a prohibition, there has been a bill in Iceland, and there has been a law-based prohibition for infant male circumcision to take place. So the law has been proposed in Iceland, a bill has been proposed in Iceland to prohibit this act from taking place. And in Germany, the ban has passed, whereby, especially in certain cities or certain states, it's prohibited for circumcision to take place. When this was questioned, currently last week, and previously in the last few years, the secularist societies and the secularist movements were challenged as to why this should be something that is being done. For what reason should this law be passed? And it was very interesting to see some of the responses. I just want to read to you some of the responses or some of the comments that were made by some of the different parties, and one in particular from the Icelandic Progressive Party, the MP by the name of Dog Gunnarsdóttir. I apologize for my poor pronunciation of his Icelandic name. He will forgive me, I'm sure. This particular MP said the following. He said, "Those procedures are unnecessary, done without informed consent of the child, non-reversible, can cause severe complications, disfigurations, and even death. A child should be old enough to give informed consent for any procedures to happen," adding that taking away the ability to circumcise would not go against the religious right of their parents. The challenge in a secular society is that historically, secularism would say, we want a space, we want a gap between church and state. And we want the ability for an independence between church and state, so that the challenges that were around in the Reformation, the challenges that were around in wars that came about from religions, are no longer prevalent in society and no longer governing us as a cultural society. Today, however, that challenge has morphed into something different. The concept today is that this liberalism, or rather this secularism, wishes for you and I to be stating that anything that impedes a child's development, or anything that may be a form of them not making their own individual choices, is something that has to be stripped from society. A child has something forced upon him or her, that is taking away his or her human right. Therefore, a child should not have any act that is going to force him or her to grow up to think in a certain way, that's going to make him a person who is going to reflect an ideal outside of what the general society's ideal is. And we need to ensure that influence isn't there. Once the child becomes 18 years old, he or she is free to be able to make their own decisions. Then they can decide whether they want to participate in any religion. But up until then, religious doctrine should not be forced upon them, because they grow up as someone who is not free to be able to choose themselves. They have been forced to think and forced to believe in a certain way. So the evolution of the thinking of secularism is changing in front of our eyes. Such that now a religious practice that is so commonly accepted, has now been outlawed, has been prohibited, or is on the verge of being prohibited altogether. On the basis of the child doesn't get to choose. Therefore, if you act upon this, you are inhibiting the child's own independent progression in his society. Think about that, not just now, but think about how that might morph in 10 or 20 or in 50 years' time in other elements of religious practice. And the way in which an Islam, if it was truly progressive, wouldn't be focused on just the mundane fiqh, and it wouldn't be focused on the cultural manifestations of its practice, but rather would be at the forefront of being a response to that question of whether or not a child should have a religious upbringing or any type of religious practice placed onto it. Let's take it to its potential logical conclusion. You are born, or you have a child. You want to give the child a religious upbringing. The first right of the child, according to Islam, is what? To give them a righteous name. So the name you want to give him, Muhammad, Ali, Fatima, Zainab, or whatever, and so on and so forth. Does by you giving him that name mold him into a certain practice? Do you give him that name so that he grows up within a certain vision, a certain scope of ideals, so that he is supposed to reflect the practices historically of that Muhammad, of that Ali, of that Fatima, of that Khadija, salamullahi alayhim? Yes. In light of that, is that going to be challenged as well? Are we now going to be in a secular society that says, well, by virtue of you even naming your child something religious, it's going to indoctrinate your child as well? Where does it end? Which religious practice is safe and secure from this type of rampant secularism? Because if it wishes to free you totally, that you can make your own choices at the age of 18, and until then you have no structure around you, the question will be posed is, well, at what point does that practice begin and what does that end? At what point does secularism state that you are actually free to be able to practice what you want? Historically, secularism is saying, we are all free. But today, secularism is saying, no, you are not free. You are only free at the age of 18. Until then, religion shouldn't have an influence upon you. So now I pose the question back. Well, what does Islam do? If our Islam is purely focused on wudu, if our Islam is purely focused on cultural manifestations, then how does Islam respond? Where is the Islam to be able to respond to this particular challenge of religion being a threat to people and religion being seen as something that has to be removed from the child altogether? Religious practice. Number two, liberalism. And the way in which liberalism itself has evolved, manifested itself today. If we think about the liberalist trend and its initiation as being a means of creating equality between gender, equality between racial identity, equality between various nations, we again have to ask, is that type of liberalism the same liberalism today, or has it evolved into something else, which is now a threat to the religious identity in itself? Interestingly enough, different manifestations of liberalism today are still sourcing types of liberalism that occurred even in its earliest strands. To give one, and I use this one to be a little bit controversial so that debate can come out of it. Take feminism as an example. What does feminism seek to do in its form of liberalization? If we argue that one avenue of feminism, which is to bring about equality between gender, if we argue another type of feminism seeks to remove gender norms within the family unit or within the society, or if we say another form of feminism wishes to place man or the male as the source of its oppression. Another type of liberalism wishes, another type of feminism wishes to place religion as the source of its oppression. So of course, feminism isn't one thing. But if you ask yourself about these forms of liberalism and the way in which they're manifesting themselves today, it makes us question as to how liberalism is impacting Islam and various religions today. Think about this question, or think about this particular scenario. There is certain statistics that have come out recently about feminism and its relationship to monotheism. Is there a more statistical likelihood that if you are a feminist, you would be an atheist, or would you be a monotheist? The United States of America, according to some statistics, 7 out of 10 women claim to believe in some sort of organized faith. 7 out of 10. Whereas, if you ask and survey feminists, do you belong to organized faith? Only 1 out of 10 will say that they adhere to an organized faith. Since 1993 to 2003, the number of people claiming atheism has tripled. Or the number of women claiming atheism has tripled, rather. Is there a relationship between this? And there appears to be, yes, trends that the liberalization has had an impact on the faith-based community. And through those various different forms of liberalism, they are attacking particular types of faith-based communities as well. Let me give you an example. The earliest works of feminism claimed that the problem was religion itself. It would claim, for example, that a woman's oppression is rooted inside religion itself. And therefore, the only way we can get rid of the oppression upon women is to get rid of the source, being religion itself. In fact, certain early authors of feminism stated that the black man who is enslaved is the same as the Muslim woman, because she is also enslaved. Therefore, our liberal program of freeing black man from slavery is incomplete until we manage to liberate the Muslim woman from the shackles of her Islam. So as these various types of liberal programs come about, the sourcing of them is very important, and therefore the way in which they manifest themselves today is also very important as well. And that challenge upon the monotheist or upon the Muslim as well. All of these things are taking place. Therefore the secularization of the society is having its impact upon the Muslim practice, and the liberalization has made an impact upon the Muslim practice as well, upon the Muslim faith. I go back to my very first question. How does Islam respond? Does the Islam that we have, in the forms that we practice it, does it have a response mechanism built in? Or is it more focused on the wudu, and is it more focused on the manifestation of ma'tam, as opposed to actually having a program of response built into it? Now, based upon these particular challenges, and seeing that there is a huge program of liberalization, a huge program of secularization taking place in the world today, it makes us question, well, what were the challenges at the time of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam? And you will see that the challenges are very interesting. We started a discussion on feminism, so let's go back to the challenges at the time of Islam and its revelation. If you were a woman or you were a female being born into the pagan era or the immediate pre-Islamic era, the types of challenges that were prevalent for a woman were unthinkable. It was beyond imagination, the extent of the oppression that was prevalent in the pagan era. First and foremost, the likelihood is that you would be alive. What were the reasons that you would be buried alive as a young girl? Either infant or grown. Primarily, there were three reasons. Number one, the first reason was that it was the culture to do so. And even if there was an overriding reason not to do it, the culture would tell you that you have to act in a certain way. And therefore you would go and bury your newborn baby daughter alive. Another reason as to why you would bury your newborn baby girl would be because that a girl, a woman, did not financially contribute to the household at that time. Whereas a boy, a man, would be. So what would happen? The boy would go out, he might work in the farm, he might become a tradesman, so he would bring money in. Whereas the girl would cost money. And so it was just easier to bury this new baby girl alive, rather than having to pay out and feed this newborn baby. The Quran talks about this, and it has ayat. It says, for example, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, لا تقتلوا أولادكم خشية إملاق نحن نرزقكم وإياهم. Do not bury your children alive. Do not kill your children. Why? We sustain them the same way we sustain you. Don't be fearful that they're going to cost you money. The same way I, God, am razik to you, I'm razik to them as well. So this was a second reason as to why girls would be born and then buried alive. Third reason would be that a father didn't want his baby girl, his daughter, to be born into such horrific standards of living for her. That she would be treated so badly that he didn't wish to see her grow up into that type of society that would be so prejudiced against her, so sexist against her, so patriarchal against her, so abusive against her. What do we mean? If you manage to survive being born and then buried alive, of course you would be married off immediately. You wouldn't have any education, and by that we mean no education at all. You would have no ability to read and write. You would have no say. You would be considered nothing more than property, such that if your husband died, your son would inherit you as property itself. It goes further. The Quran talks about the level of oppression upon women, such that if you would survive all of this, if you manage not to be buried alive, and then if you manage not to be beaten and killed, or considered as property and nothing more than that, if you happen to survive all of this, the Quran mentions that even then, if you were a woman, you might still be sold into slavery or prostitution. For example, the Quran has two verses where it mentions this particular practice and this particular act. Ayah of the Quran says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, لا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل. Do not eat up wealth amongst yourselves in falsities. Our sixth Imam, Jafaria salawatullah wa salamu alayhi, has a hadith about what this verse means. He says, at the time of revelation and in the period of Jahiliyyah, men in Arabia used to gamble with each other. And their gambling was just such a norm. And when they lost a bet, rather than paying off your debt by giving away your own property or your wealth to settle the score, rather than giving away something that, would be a material value, you would sell your own family members into slavery and prostitution. Can you think about what was going on in that time? So the Quran said, لا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل. Do not eat up your wealth between each other in falsities. Stop selling your own family members into prostitution to pay off your gambling debts. Now, all along, when there was this type of oppression upon the woman, upon a female, at every point, Islam, through the Quran and through the prophetic practice, sought to stop these oppressions and liberate its society from these ill practices. At every point. The moment it saw that girls were being buried alive, the verse came to challenge it and say to you that on the Day of Judgment you will be asked about this. That the newborn polytheistic child, this girl who has been buried alive, will ask you on the Day of Judgment, بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ, for what reason did you bury me alive? And it addressed the men. And it said to them in the hadith that the best of husbands are those who are best towards their wives. And it addressed the children to have respect of their mothers instead of considering them as inherited property and forcing their own family members into prostitution. The hadith came and said, paradise is underneath the feet of your mother. At every point, wherever there was this oppression, wherever there was this backwardness, wherever there was this jahiliyyah, wherever there was this inhibition for the human being to grow, to be able to achieve the fullness of their potential, Islam, true Islam, came and challenged this through the Quran, through the ayat, through the ahadith, through the prophetic practice, in order to liberate the society from those practices altogether. So again, we go back to our question. What are the challenges that we see in the society coming from a progressive society? Do we really live in a progressive society? Or is it a society that is actually debilitating us? That is actually limiting our potentials? And then when you see the sources of these limitations, such as through secularization, such as through liberalism, and the way it specifically challenges the Muslim community, do we see an Islam that is truly progressive, or do we see an Islam that is also limiting our practices as well? If the society is inhibiting us, and our Islam is inhibiting us, then it's no surprise that we're in a regressive trend. If the society is limiting us, and the Islam is progressive, then only one type of people will be progressive. Whereas if the society is truly progressive, and the Islam is truly progressive, then both of them will feed off each other, and no matter what part of society you live in, then both trends of society will be progressive and helping society to fulfill the fullness of its God-given potential. And actually, this is the way in which Islam was at the time of the Holy Prophet of Islam. Even if you didn't believe in Islam, even if you weren't a Muslim, Islam was liberating you the same way it was liberating the Muslim as well. So when we ask, what are the solutions and what is Tawheed and how can we have Tawheed in a progressive, secular, liberal society, what we're actually asking is, how did the Holy Prophet of Islam champion a true Islam relative to the challenges that we're faced with at that particular time? Because when you saw a type of Islam that was truly liberating itself, truly bringing society to the fullness of its potential, only then was Tawheed being lived and not just termed in a very limiting concept. Tawheed then was not fiqh. Tawheed then was not culture. Tawheed then was helping the human being and the society liberate itself from every type of challenge that stopped it from the growth that was the potential of that human community. At that time, Islam pushed back against oppression. At that time, Islam was a source of ridding poverty. At that time, Islam was a source of human progression. At that time, Islam was the source of human rights. I ask that question again. Well, which Tawheed in which Islam are we living today? Because if we want to be able to answer that question properly, it makes us think tonight about what is our Islam and whether that Islam is actually in keeping with the type of Islam that was brought at the time of revelation and the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Now, Tawheed is going to be defined in a number of ways. Spirituality is going to be defined in a number of ways. I will define it as the following. Spirituality is allowing for the human being to feel and to experience the already existing oneness of Allah within you and without you. Allah is already prevalent within my heart, and Allah is already prevalent here within these walls. He is no more in Mecca than He is here, and He is no less here than He is in Mecca. Allah does not exist more in the haram of Hussein salamullahi alayhi than He does in your own house. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists no more in the moons of Saturn than He does in Medina. And what we end up thinking about Tawheed often, again, is this secularized notion of Godhood. That in here, in these four walls, is spirituality, and God doesn't exist outside of these four walls. Because we move into a world that doesn't see God. And again, these are the notions that cripple our understanding of Islam altogether. God is no more in you than He is in me. And He is no less in you than He is in Ayatollah Sistani. God is God. And God is ever existing. And God is omnipresent. So when we ask the question of Tawheed and the seeking of Tawheed and the maintenance of Tawheed in a regressive society, what we're actually saying is that I am not feeling the presence of God because of me allowing a regressive society to impact me in my day-to-day life. I'm asking a very simple question. Was there a more regressive society than the one at the time of pre-Islamic Arabia? Let's go back into it. Because again, we have to understand what was present at the time of the Holy Prophet of Islam. So we've given examples of what it was like for a woman. But generally, at that time, they used to perform tawaf of the Holy Kaaba naked, singing, clapping and dancing. At that time, they used to go to war with each other through tribes for any excuse. To the extent that they even forgot about why they were going to war with each other in the first place. At that time, rather than thinking about their society, every tribe had their own god. And if you had your own god, the structure of the society was such that your god may be a great god, a big god, or a small god. If your god was a big god, your god would be a god of war, a god of rizq, a God of bringing male children into society. If you had a small God, a lesser popular God, when you needed something, where would you go? You would give a tribute to the big God, wouldn't you? Now, every one of those tribes needed the big gods. All of them needed success in war, because they constantly had tribal wars. All of them wanted male children and not female children. All of them wanted rizq, so where would they go? Your tribe, even if it had a small god, it would go there. Your tribe would go there. And each one of your tribes would be delivering a certain type of tribute. Maybe you would give fine cloth. Maybe you would give sheep. Maybe you would give camels. Maybe you would give swords. And all of you would be giving your tributes, financial tributes, to the large gods. So who would get wealthier? The tribes that had the big gods. And who would get poorer? All the rest of you. So constantly throughout the year, you are giving your wealth to this big God, and these guys are accumulating and accumulating and accumulating. And so the whole society was structured in the type of way that the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. So the whole society was structured in all of these ways that were oppressive, that were manipulative. What was the source of all these problems? What was the source of all these problems? Shirk. Why was shirk the source of all of these types of problems? Be you a woman, be you a tribal society, be you a black person enslaved. The answer is very simple. Because they took their idols and believed that these idols had power over themselves. It's like me saying this to you. Imagine this is your idol. For many of us it is our idol. Yeah? But imagine this is the rocks. Imagine this is the rocks of the idols 1400 years ago. Can this idol benefit you? Can it harm you? Can't do anything at all. But the people of Arabia had begun to believe that these things, these inanimate objects, these stones, these rocks that were clumped together by mud, these were your gods. What is the problem with that? Why is that such a problem? Very simply, because if you can believe an inanimate object is your God, then you can be told anything else and believe anything else is the right way to live. If I tell you, bury your daughter alive, you will do it. If I tell you to go to war with this tribe, you will do it without even thinking for yourself. If I tell you, bring all of your wealth and sacrifice it at the altar of this God in order to gain more wealth, you will do it. Because your aql has been shackled altogether by virtue of thinking that an inanimate object is your God in the first place. Now that I've got you to think in this particular way, I can trick you to doing anything else. Islam, in its tawheed, had to break that thinking, break those practices, break those cultures, break those debilitating ideas, and through that, it was able to liberate its society from those practices, from those shackles altogether. And the way in which it did it was by reintroducing God at the helm of everything that they were trying to achieve. You're bringing up a child, do it for the sake of God. You're trying to earn wealth, do it for the sake of God. You're going to war with the pagans, do it for the sake of God. You're going on pilgrimage, do it for the sake of God. You're dressing up in the morning, do it for the sake of God. There is so much that is God-centric to the extent that even if you walk into the bathroom, you are told, walk into the bathroom in a certain way, exit the bathroom in a certain way. Everything became God-centric. Everything became about God being within you and God being around you. And the whole concept of Tawheed was no longer just this mundane notion, but it was at the forefront and the helm of everything you did, and it managed to change the society altogether. Now this is what is being battled. The true Islam, the true Tawheed, has all but departed, and we have turned Islam not into a source of liberation, not into a source of achievement, not into the source of seeing God at the helm of everything we do, but the Islam that we practice is all about the fiqh and all about the cultural manifestation of it. As a result of that type of Islam, it can never be a source to combat the rampant secularization and the rampant liberalism that is taking place within our society, because the Islam we practice is more closely associated to secularism and more closely associated to liberalism in the first place. We think God is in these four walls. That's what secularism wants you to think. We think our achievement is based upon how much we earn and how much we can economically develop ourselves. That's what liberalism wants you to think. And therefore, as long as our starting point is to adopt a liberal, secular way of thinking, our Tawheed will never be the source of liberation from that in the first place. Because our Tawheed is tainted through those ideas in the first place. So here, our discussion on night 1 is pointing at what? The conclusion of tonight is what? It is to make us think about what are we faced with. What was the Islam at the time of the Holy Prophet? And what is the Islam of today? Because if we're going to ask ourselves tomorrow night for Islam and Tawheed to be the source of liberation from secularism, from liberalism, from regressive society, it has to be declothed from those things in the first place. Because if we're living a type of Tawheed that is actually clothed by liberalism and by secularism, then Tawheed can never truly be the source of liberation that you're asking for in this discussion in the first place. How did Islam at that time, Tawheed, liberate such pagan minds, such jahil practices? And when you see those practices in society today manifesting itself, is the Islam that we are practicing capable of liberating those practices or not? That's the question that we ask tonight as our conclusion. So think about this now as your homework for you to reflect on, and we come back tomorrow to be able to try to provide solutions to those questions. Let's list a few, just as bullet points for you to think about tonight as your homework. I haven't researched this statistic here in the United States, so you'll have to forgive me. But we are a relative society to the UK, by and large. A study came out in November or October of last year, so we're very close, we're 4 or 5 months. The study asked about whether you are religious or irreligious, and what proportion of society is atheistic or agnostic, monotheistic, and so on and so forth. 71% of Brits in 2017 identified as not believing in God. 71%. We normally hear that that's a Christian society. Well, where is that Christian society? And where are those Christian values? Is the Tawheed that we are practicing, is the Islam that we are practicing a means of pushing back that rampant atheism today? Neo-atheism? Yes or no? When we talk about poverty and wealth inequality. Again, a statistic that 1% globally of people control somewhere in the region of 82% of the world's wealth. Is the Islam that we are practicing and we understand a means of liberation from that? Yes or no? The Black Lives Matter movement, where a certain community feels overly targeted through police brutality, is the Islam that we are practicing a means of protection and liberation from that type of brutality? Yes or no? When it comes to the amount of materialism, I'll give you an interesting statistic to think about this for yourselves, and how manipulated we are through materialism. I was reading this just the other day. In 1993, in China, there was a university that started something called Singles Day. Meaning, people who are single, they could celebrate being single. It's almost the opposite of Valentine's Day. But in Valentine's Day, most of us are single anyway, so we end up celebrating Valentine's Day alone anyway. Nevertheless, 11th of November, 11/11, i.e. 1/1, singles. 11/11 is the day in China in which you celebrate Singles Day. This started when? In a university in 1993. After a few years, Alibaba, you all know Alibaba? Yeah, Alibaba, the online shop, online mega shop. It's one of the largest companies in the world, yes? One of the most profitable companies in the world. Alibaba, a few years back, decided that they would commercialize and monetize Singles Day. So they started trying to make it that Singles Day, you should buy a fellow single a present. You should buy yourself a present because you are single and you should celebrate it. And so on and so forth. Last year, 11/11, 2017, they had a 24-hour extravaganza TV event to celebrate Singles Day. In the idea that across China, you should spend money because someone you know is single or because you are single, and so on and so forth. They had a 24-hour TV extravaganza. They brought Hollywood celebrities, they brought Bollywood celebrities, they got, all the shows, all the singers, all the actors to come to China and celebrate Singles Day. Sponsored by whom? Alibaba. I'm going to ask you a very simple question. You can search this yourself on Google. 11/11, 2017. How much do you think was spent on that day just with Alibaba? Because Alibaba are sponsoring it, monetizing it. How much do you think, give me an answer, how much do you think Alibaba made on one day last year from Singles Day? Give me a shout out how much.
100 million.
He knows the answer. Why are you giving the answer for? Let these guys answer. How much?
17.8 billion.
I invite you to come here and take my place because you don't need me. Yeah? Say it again.
17.8 billion.
And where are you getting that information from? Ayatollah Google. Right? Yes?
Yes.
Is that the figure for 2017? Double check that.
Yep.
Okay, excellent. $17 billion was spent on a day that started in 1993. That's how manipulated you are as a society. The commercialization of Christmas, the commercialization of Easter, the commercialization of Halloween. I'm asking a question. This is rampant in a liberal society. Where is the Islam that actually liberates people from this type of manipulation? Can you see that? So when we talk about Tawheed, what we're asking for is the removal of all those types of things that block you from achieving the fullness of your potential. And that would be a true Tawheed that responds to the challenges of 2018. So now, the homework I leave you is this. It's a really simple question. What type of Islam do you practice? Do you and I find it to be concurrent with the liberating Islam that was started by the Holy Prophet? Or do we find our Islam and Tawheed coloured by all types of external ideologies? And through those external ideologies, we have come to redefine our Tawheed and redefine our Islam. That's the question I leave you with to reflect on tonight as your homework. Because for us to be able to successfully answer it tomorrow and to offer some sort of tool for Tawheed, true Tawheed, to be a source against the progressive or regressive societies that we live in, it requires you and I to do some internal thinking and to do some reflection upon ourselves. How you and I practice, how you and I define our Islam, how we define our Tawheed, and then tomorrow night, inshaAllah, we return to try to respond to some of those questions, God willing. InshaAllah, tonight has just thrown you some questions to think about, for you and I to just reflect on. In conclusion, number one, how do we define some of these terms that we are using? When you and I say we are Muslims, we are following Tawheed, when we see the challenges of liberalism, what are those things that are facing us? Number two, what was the Islam that was brought to us by the Holy Prophet of Islam? And number three, is the Islam that we practice in accordance with that original Islam, or is it something that has been vastly changed and manipulated so that it is not actually a means of responding to the challenges that we find within our society? Inshallah, we come back tomorrow night to be able to discuss these things. Walhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammad wa alihi at-tahirin.
So, thank you, Sheikh Jafar. Upon further review, it was actually 25.3 billion for the Alibaba in 2017. So, we just wanted to clarify that. Tomorrow we will be continuing night 2 of this program. We'll be meeting here at 6:30, and also Sheikh Jafar will be speaking once again on the subject matter of Tawheed and progressive society. Followed by, we'll be doing a question and answer session, I believe, for 45 minutes or so tomorrow. So, inshallah, I'll see you then tomorrow. Thank you for coming.
I